2 Samuel chapter 16. David continues his flight from Absalom. We know that Absalom had started his insurrection against David, and in the last chapter we saw that Absalom had actually entered into Jerusalem after David had left. And now we see in this particular chapter some of the events that happened to David as he flees from Jerusalem to regroup himself, and what happens in Jerusalem under Absalom's presence. So the people in the context, we've seen the majority of these before. We have David, we have Ziba, which is Mephibosheth's servant. We see Shimei, the son of Gir, which is the house of Saul. Abishai, the son of Zeruiah. Absalom, Ahithophel, Hushai, the Archite, and David's 10 concubines. A lot of people, but they play some important roles in what happens. And the context is the Mount of Olives, Jerusalem, and Bahurim. Now you probably remember Bahurim, which is also called Nob, but this is where David's first wife, Michal, and her husband lived at when she was removed from her husband and brought to David. So when we look at these particular places on the map, I tried to blow this up as much as I could, but get my little thing going here if it'll work. Okay, this over here is the Dead Sea, and this is the River Jordan coming down, so we kind of give an idea of where all this is at. But from Jerusalem to Mount Olives is just a short distance, and this is where David had worshipped God. And right above that is Bahurim, and this is where Shimei begins to curse David. And I don't know if you can see those little dotted lines through here, but this is one of the main roads that people followed as they traveled. So it would make sense that David would leave Jerusalem, go to Mount of Olives, and then travel this road past Bahurim as he made his way down to the river. And so evidently this is the wilderness in which it says that he went into. So I can get rid of this thing now. So if we were to look at this particular chapter, there's some 4 or 5 things that kind of stand out to us. In the first 4 verses, we see that Ziba brings provisions to David and accuses Mephibosheth of treason. Verses 5 through 8, we see that David forbids any harm to Shimei, and he hurls epithets and stones at him, curses and stones at him. David refuses to harm Shimei on the grounds that this may be part of God's punishment to him. You remember, God said that he was going to be punished because of his sins. Hushai gains favor with Absalom to be one of his advisors. And at the advice of Ahithophel, Absalom commits fornication with David's concubines in Jerusalem. So, kind of give some introductory thoughts to this particular chapter. We saw that in the last chapter, David was pretty distraught about the events that had happened. They came suddenly, he was unaware, and he was probably just dumbfounded at the fact that this had grown to such large proportions without his knowledge of these things happening. And so when he left Jerusalem, he was weeping, he was crying, and those that were with him. And so he traveled. Even so, he does rationally set up a system of spies and communication as he flees. He had enough sense to know that if he was going to deal with this insurrection, he's going to have to deal with it the best way possible. So he sets up a system of communication to find out what's going on in the throne room and have it delivered back to him. Now he sees that he makes a rash decision concerning Mephibosheth without concerns for the facts. And to him, this particular argument, this particular situation was not important. More important things was the stability of the nation and his particular position as king. So when he makes this decision, he makes it's just kind of a quick, off the top of the head decision. We see David's humility when cursed by Shimei, and he does this by taking into consideration the curses come from God. And this is evident when we contrast David's humility with the vengeance of Saul against God's judgment. We see David's humility in this particular case or this particular situation, and we look back at Saul and what happened to him when God cursed him and judged him. He was very vengeful, and he tried to overcome God's judgment by rebelling. And then finally, Ahithophel's advice to Absalom may have had another use, and this was vengeance on David for the ill treatment done to Bathsheba. And this was something I ran across yesterday, and never really dawned on me, but I thought it was kind of interesting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the class. So there's a violation against the law of Moses, and this is what Absalom did with David's concubines. The law of Moses absolutely forbids adultery with his father's wife. This was a wicked thing, and it was not, it was punishable probably by death. Leviticus 18:8, it says, the nakedness of your father's wife you shall not uncover, it is your father's nakedness. And then in Deuteronomy 27, verse 20, cursed is the one who lies with his father's wife because he has uncovered his father's bed. So this was absolutely forbidden under the law of Moses, and yet Absalom actually had no concern for that and did what he did. So that gets us back to where we were at. When David leaves, he goes to the Mount of Olives, and on his way, I guess, off of the mount, and this was just maybe a mile or two off out of Jerusalem, Ziba brings provisions to David, as we see in the first few verses. And he meets David, and David says, what are you doing here? What is this? And he tells him that I'm bringing your provisions to your people. I know you're hungry, you're thirsty, and you're faint. You need this to help you on your journey. So Ziba was making a good impression to David. And I think in Ziba's mind, he was self-serving. Whenever you see a bad situation happening, the one thing you want to try to do is make life as good for you as you can. So in his mind, it was probably thinking, it's not going to do me any harm to go show David some kindness. If David comes back to Jerusalem, he will remember this, what I did for him. But if he doesn't come back to Jerusalem and Absalom becomes king, I've lost nothing except, a bunch of bread, a bunch of raisin cakes, and some wine for the men, and a couple of mules. So he brings this to him, and he says that this is for your, for your sustenance. And then the king asks in verse 3, where is your master's son, Mephibosheth? Now this is where we see the self-serving interest of Ziba. In his mind, it was, okay, now's an opportunity to show David how much I'm concerned about him, and at the same time drag his master through the mud. So he says, indeed, he is staying in Jerusalem, for he said, today is the house of Israel will restore the kingdom to my fathers to me. So he pretty much told David that Mephibosheth was thinking that this insurrection was going to bring the kingdom back to the house of Saul. And David, not thinking twice about what he had just said, looked at it as an individual that had shown no respect and no courtesy for what David had done for him, and he said, you just take everything that he has and go your way. It all belongs to you now. Without hearing the other side of the story and finding out what is actually true. But at the same time, I don't understand why David didn't think that since Absalom is the one behind the insurrection and Absalom is the one setting himself up as the king in Jerusalem, why is this, this doesn't make sense. Why does Mephibosheth think it's all going to be handed over to him? Now, it may have been that this is what Mephibosheth has said, and David said, well, I know it's not going to happen, but if that's his thought anyway, well, just let it be. I'm just automatically threw this boy into poverty by taking his possessions away from him. So Ziba probably didn't expect this, and he was probably just elated to have it. So he was glad that he found favor in the sight of David and went on his way back to Jerusalem, probably just as happy as he could be to Mephibosheth to hit the road. Now when the king came to Bahurim, this was like I said, the city in which Michael and her second husband, I guess you could say, lived. And as they were passing by, they came across a fellow by the name of Shimei. He was the son of Gera, and he was from the house of Saul. And he came out, and as the text says in verses 5 and following, he says, he came out cursing continuously as he came, and he threw stones at David and at all the servants of the king David, and all the people and all the mighty men were on the right hand and on the left. It seems like when the rock throwing started, the troop that was with him, the Cherethites, the Perethites, and his kind of like his personal bodyguard, they kind of surrounded David on all sides to keep the rocks from hitting David. So they moved into position to keep him protected. And then Shimei said thus when he cursed, come out. In other words, come out from among all these people. Come out and face my charges against you. You bloodthirsty man, you rogue. The Lord has brought upon you all the blood of the house of Saul, at whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom your son. So now you are caught in your own evil, because you're a bloodthirsty man. Now, the accusations that Shimei is making against David really has no bearing. Well, first of all, he calls him a bloodthirsty man, and then he says he's nothing more than a rogue, and then he says that the Lord has placed the blood of Saul's house upon David, and that David had taken the throne away from Saul, and that Absalom had taken the throne away from him, and that David was caught up in his own evil because of his own sins. It's interesting, and that you might want to point out the fact that when he was cursing David, he invokes the name of God in this curse. And I think this is, you're treading on dangerous ground when you do that, because he's making an accusation that the Lord has brought upon you the blood of the house of Saul, at whose place you've reigned. So he's making the accusation of what he's saying is the act of God. And of course, there's no valid reason for that. And I think that Shimei is, I guess, putting himself in a position that by doing so, he's bringing the judgment of God upon his own head. Now, Abishai, the son of Zechariah, he was kind of aggravated about this, and it's interesting that his nephews, Joab, Abishai, and I forgot the other guy's name. The one that was killed earlier in the first part of the book. These guys were pretty rough. They're just probably some of the roughest people I've read about in this particular book. He was quick to say this man needs to be put to death. He's nothing more than just a worthless dead dog in the middle of the road. He's useless. Let me kill him. He said, I'm ready to take off his head. He was quick to act. And David said, what have I to do with you, sons of Zechariah? So let him curse, because the Lord has said unto him, curse David. Who then is to say, why have you done so? In other words, David is saying, what have I to do with you? What am I going to do with you? I want really no part of what you're about to do, because if the man is cursing me, and if the curse is coming from God, then let him curse, because that is my judgment that God has placed upon me, to be cursed in this life because of my sin. God forgave me of my sins, but he said that I have to understand that I've got to face the consequences of what I did throughout my life. And he says, if this is a curse indeed coming from God, we do not need to harm this man, because he is acting in the interest of God. So David didn't know, but he was not going to put it to chance and lose his standing with God that he has based on supposition. So he was correct in saying that he was under God's care. Now, when I look at what Shimei was doing, is he was following David, throwing rocks at him and cursing him, and it kind of gave me the impression of, the situation of Job, when they said, just curse God and die. And that's, I think, what Shimei was trying to get David to do. Curse God and go your own way. the same thing with Jesus. You know, there were many times that the people, said, if you're the Son of God, come down from the cross. You know, it's just the accusations to get them to try to violate their conscience with God. And I think I see a lot of that type of humility in David that we see in Job and in Christ, that to do what God wants to do, even though I have to bear punishment over it, that is what I'm going to do, is do what God has desired us to do. So, now the accusations that Shimei made against David really had no bearing, because even though David was correct in saying that he was under God's care, and his sins were put away, he had to endure those consequences. So David understood that he was under God's punishment. But we have to understand too that when Shimei said that the blood of the house of Saul was upon his head, David never once tried to take Saul's life, and he really went to a great extent to try to avoid confrontation with Saul that would find himself in that particular position. David did not take the throne away from Saul. God was the one that took the throne away from Saul and placed it in David's hands. So God did not place the blood of Saul upon his head. It was brought upon his own head because of his own disobedience, as you remember back in 1 Samuel chapter 16. So it seems to me that this particular situation, I see the acts of Satan working against David. I think the situation was that now we found a man that is after God's own heart in a despairing point in his life, like Job and like Christ was. Now's the time to act, to see if I can push him over that edge and get him to curse God for what is happening to him. So David refuses to harm Shimei on these grounds that, it could be just part of God's punishment to him. Now, he continues to follow him, and I don't know how far he went with them, but he says he continues to follow him, throwing rocks at him, and cursing him and kicking up the dust, just making life miserable for David as he travels down the road. And I kind of thought it was kind of interesting. He said that he was on the road and Shimei was on the hillside, so he probably had the tactical advantage of getting those rocks to land where he wanted them to land. So don't think he was just running alongside of him. He was in that elevated position that he could do quite a bit of harm to him if his aim was very well. But he said he continued to go so until they became weary, and then they refreshed themselves there. Now, King James, New King James Version doesn't say it, but Septuagint, I think the Syriac versions of the Bible says that they had stopped at the Jordan River. Josephus, when I was reading his account of it, says that they had stopped at the Jordan River. Whether they did or not, I don't know. But I do know that it would make sense that they would stop at a place where there's a large body of water so that they could refresh themselves. So it's a good possibility that they made their way out of the mountainous area down into the plains towards the Jordan. So there's a good chance that they were there. They hadn't crossed over yet, but they were still on the side that Jerusalem was on. Now, David made it this far. He's endured punishment, shame. Now we see Absalom in his role of what happens to him in Jerusalem. Now Hushai, as we remember from the last chapter, David had sent Hushai into Jerusalem to become one of his counselors and kind of thwart the judgment of Abishai. Is that his name? Is that his name? Ahithophel. I'll be glad when I get finished with this book, because these names are just driving me crazy. So Hushai goes to the king, and the first thing he does is he says, "Long live the king, long live the king." In other words, praise the king for being who he is, and let your reign be long. Now Absalom is no dummy. First thing he does is he looks at Hushai, and he knows who Hushai is. probably one of David's most trusted advisors, and he's thinking, why aren't you in the wilderness with David? And why are you here trying to get my good favors? So this guy was trying to convince Absalom that I am here for the benefit of the throne and for the nation of Israel. If you kind of keep that thought in mind, what he tells Absalom really isn't deceitful, even though I think David Pratt in his book says it was a deceitful act. It may be, but I kind of looked at it from a different standpoint. And that's the unique thing about the English language. You can say something and it could mean something else. And I think maybe that's a reason why a lot of arguments and conflicts happen, is because language misconveys what we're actually thinking. But Absalom said to Hushai, is this your loyalty to your friend? Why do you not go with your friend? And Hushai said to Absalom, no, but whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel choose, his I will be, and with him I will remain. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve in the presence of his son, as I have served in the presence of his father? So will I be in your presence. So Absalom is looking at this, and he's hearing this, and he's thinking, okay, Hushai just said he's going to serve whoever the Lord and the people of Israel establish to be king in Jerusalem, and that he will serve him with just as much loyalty as he served the former king. So he probably was thinking, this is a wise man, I'll keep him with me, but I'll keep him over here kind of as a secondary advisor and just see what he has to come up with. But when you look at what Hushai said to Absalom, he says, no, but whom the Lord, let's stop right there, has chosen to be the leader of Israel. Who did the Lord choose? Was it Absalom or was it David? It was David. So first statement he said was true. And then he said, and this people and all the men of Israel choose. Did all the people of Israel want David to be king? I can tell you one person right off the bat didn't have any use for David. Shimei. So the second statement is kind of misleading, but it's true in fact. Because not all people will have David, but those that will have the king that God has established, these are the people that I will serve. So again, even though he may have just told what he did to Absalom, I think so far he's kind of telling him the truth, but giving Absalom a different idea of what he's saying. And he says, furthermore, he says, and I will with him will I remain. In other words, who is ever the king of Israel, and whoever that's the majority of the people will support David, this is the man that I will serve, the king of Israel, the rightful king. He says, I will be his, and his I will be, and with him I will remain. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve in the presence of his son, as I have served in his father's presence? So will I be in your presence. In other words, my servitude to you will be just like the servitude with David. I will give you advice and I will give you wisdom, just like I gave David, I will give to you. Whether or not you accept it, whether or not you like what I have to say, that's up to you to accept. So he may have been deceitful in giving Absalom a false impression of what he's saying, but at the same time, Hushai was saying that my service is to the rightful king, and him I will serve for my life. So take that as you will. I kind of thought it was interesting how this man was playing his words against the king, or against Absalom, playing his words with Absalom to get him to understand what he was saying. So anyway, he wiggles his way into Absalom's court and becomes, I guess, his secondary advisor, because Absalom chose Ahithophel. I guess this is his first advisor. Now, Ahithophel was asked by Absalom, what should I do? Because he understood now that even though he was in Jerusalem, he was sitting on the throne, and he had control of the city, and he had people that were supporting him, he knew that this was not going to be solidified as long as David was alive. As long as I as long as David had some hold upon his kingdom, the people really will not 100% accept me as their king. So he goes to Absalom, goes to Ahithophel, and said, what should I do to strengthen my hold upon this nation? So Ahithophel's advice was probably the first thing that kings do when they conquer another king, and that is to absorb his household and take possession of everything that belongs to him, and that includes his family, his wives, and his harem, if you want to say. And they've now become part of him. That is taking the second step into solidifying your claim over the throne. So he says, go into your father's concubines, whom he left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear you, and that you are abhorred by your father. So here was the advice that he had given to him. The advice really appealed, I think, to Absalom. You know, you got to understand this man's attitude to begin with. He killed his brother. He's trying to take the throne away from David, and really, I think he's after David's life. So as long as David's alive, he's going to be an obstacle in my path to my own selfish desires. So when this was projected to Absalom to do, I think it was just right up his alley. He didn't put it off. He didn't think about it. He didn't weigh the consequences. But he went. It was one of the first things he did. He said, "Set the tent up." The tent was set up, and he went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel, and committed this wicked act in front of all the people. Now, this was the fulfillment of Nathan's, curse from God to David. God had said that vengeance and violence would rise up within your own family, and that your wives would be given to your neighbor. Now, I kind of looked at that word neighbor a little bit, and I said, you know, a neighbor's a guy living next door to me. But I think what Nathan was saying is that the neighbor being referred to here is someone that is close to you, someone that is, considered very friendly to you. So that would indeed include David's son being his neighbor, and that relationship of being close to David. And as we saw earlier, that this was in full violation of the law. Now, one thing I didn't think about, or really didn't cross my mind, but there may have been a second reason for why Absalom did what he did. And I mean, Ahithophel told Absalom to do what he had done. And that was because it may have been an opportunity for him to place vengeance or give vengeance to David for the ill treatment that he had done to Bathsheba. Now, why would that be important to Ahithophel? Anybody know? I should have put this one up on the board because like I said, when I saw it, I said, oh, this is interesting. If you don't have Matthew Henry's commentaries, you really need to get them. That guy is smart. Even though it's a couple hundred years old, that guy has got his act together in a lot of these things. But what he pointed out was, and we saw this when David inquired about who Bathsheba was, back in chapter 11, verse 3, they told him that she is a daughter of Eliam, or Eliam. I'm not sure how you say that. Now, who is this fellow? Well, Eliam was the son of Ahithophel. And we will see that when we get to chapter 23 and verse 34. So Bathsheba was Ahithophel's granddaughter in that respect. So now he is saying, what happened to my granddaughter is now fixing to happen to David's wives. I'm fixing to take vengeance on David for what he did to her. That's a second possibility. So I thought that was interesting. If you've never thought about it before, then we can see how vengeance can probably stay in a person's mind for many years before it happens. Just like Amnon with Tamar, vengeance of Absalom against his brother. So we see that here. So the advice of Ahithophel, which he'd given in those days, was as one if he had been inquired at the oracle of God. In other words, they're saying that he was not really an oracle of God, but he had a lot of common sense and he had a lot of wisdom about how the world works, and was able to make good advice based on his knowledge. And so he was, so all the advice Ahithophel gave both to David and to Absalom was based on this. And I think Ahithophel was probably one that kept a lot of the events that were happening in Israel with Absalom's rebellion out of David's ears. And I think it was because now I can get back at what he did to my granddaughter, and now I'm supporting a man that I see that can overcome the throne of David. So what can we learn from all this? Unlike David, we need to be sure that we hear both sides of the story and not make hasty judgments. When someone brings an accusation against us or against someone else, we need to have enough wisdom and enough patience to listen to the story and weigh the events and make good judgments. And unlike Shimei, do not curse those whom God has appointed. Shimei's fate, we didn't talk about this, but Shimei's fate fell to Solomon by David's command to Solomon to deal with him after he died. And Solomon gave him a particular situation that he was going to live in Israel. You've got to live under these conditions. Shimei broke those conditions and Solomon put him to death. Like David, when cursed, be humble. And like Hushai, choose to serve the greater good. When you see evil happening, even though it may become the power of the land or the power of the moment, choose the greater good. And unlike Ahithophel, let your advice be as righteous as possible. Do not let it be deceitful or cause someone to sin. And do not be like Absalom and use wickedness to achieve your personal objectives. And Absalom was good about doing that. Nothing stood in his way to achieve what he wanted to achieve. So anybody got any questions or comments on that? Okay, one other thing I wanted to look at, we talked about the house of David. We can see that real good, can't we? But I want to kind of go over some of the main players, because as the rest of this book plays out, these players are going to come in to play. Now, I kind of cleaned out some of the garbage, and this is what we got. I say garbage, some of the non-important facts, and this is what we got. So when we look at players, and I hope you can see that a little better, but here's what we got. Okay, we do know that Amnon seduced Tamar, and because of that, Absalom killed his brother Amnon. We know that for a fact. Now, Joab not only killed Abner, I should put Abner on here, which was, I think, the nephew to Saul, but Joab, as we will see in the coming chapters, kills Absalom because of his coup against David. And we know, or we will know, that Absalom removes Joab from being the captain over the army and replaces him with Amasa. After the coup is over with and David is restored to the kingdom, Joab kills Amasa, which is David's nephew. So now we have Joab, which is David's nephew, killing one of his sons and killing one of his nephews. So Joab is not a guy that you want to have to be cross with, because he was a very violent man. So with that said, when Solomon comes into power, and we won't read this, but if you read the first couple of chapters of 1 Kings, you will see this, that Adonijah tries to take or usurp the throne away from Solomon, and because of that, Solomon kills Adonijah. So when you look at David's household, the sons that we know anything about are all dead, except Solomon. Amnon's dead, Adonijah will die, Absalom will die, Joab will be killed by Solomon because of David's telling him that he needs to be reckoned because of the death of Abner. And the only one that we, I think, is still alive when all this is over with is Abishai. Now, he also had other sons and daughters, but we don't know anything about them. It may be that these children were looking at what was happening in David's life, and they were thinking, I don't want any part of this, and they stayed out of the picture. Or it may be that they had met their end through other means. So kind of get these people in your mind as you go through the rest of this book, because they all become important players. And when you read these names, don't think they're just some stray guy or some unimportant person. They're all interconnected within David's family. And as God said, the sword will never depart from your family.
Yeah, you said Joab killed Absalom?
Yes.
Well, I thought in the next chapter, when Absalom was killed, he was riding a mule, and he got hung up in an oak tree and hung himself.
Well, he was hanging there, and in chapter 18, verse 14, it says, Joab said, I cannot linger with you, and he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart. So he was hanging from that tree and got tangled up, couldn't get out.
He just got hung up.
And so Joab finished the course. So now, you got to understand, and this is why I try to emphasize it, when you read the Psalms and place them in David's life, you see what has happened in David's family that I think is due for his lack of ability to when you have an extended family like that, it's impossible to bring your children up in the way of the Lord, and it never happened. But David's heart was always towards God, even though he had adversities in his own family and he had adversities in the world about him. His heart was always trying to do what God wanted him to do, even though he sinned and did things incorrectly. But he always tried to repent of those sins and try to get those corrected. We'll begin chapter 17 Wednesday night. Thank you for your attention.